because life doesn't have to be mediocre. I'm Sarah Muliati. I'm filling in for our usual host, Rick Zanati, and we have our wonderful co-host, Dr. Susan Nash, with us today. And
hello,
hello, Susan. And we have our guest is Dr. Gary Stading. He's the dean of the College of Business, Engineering, and Technology at Texas A&M University at Texarkana. So it's going to be a good show, but first let's run our intro. All right, so we're back, and so Dr. Stading, if you could tell us some of the programs that you oversee.
So our university is a fairly small university, but we're the smallest of the Texas A&M system universities, but we pack a lot of punch, and we're proud of the things we do. So I think in particular for this audience and some of the programs that we've been talking about are probably centered around our MBA program. And our MBA program has just a few concentrations that we hope will interest your viewership. We have an energy management MBA. We have a supply chain MBA. Supply chain management MBA. We have an information technology MBA. And they're all kind of geared towards industry and particularly the oil and gas, the energy industry, things like that. And then we have a general MBA too, but I think the concentrations are probably of most interest to your audience.
I'm really excited about the energy leadership program, energy management, as probably a lot of the listeners and viewers already know. AAPG entered into an arrangement with Texas A&M Texarkana several years ago to offer what was a really, really unique opportunity for geologists to diversify. And most geologists already have a master's, but it's in a science. This is a way to broaden themselves and prepare themselves for leadership roles in their companies. And we've had some really good success stories. There was one person who was from India who, after he got his MBA, rocketed up and now is a vice president, and all kinds of success stories. What are your thoughts about the way that this program helps a scientist?
So the way it helps develop those very leadership skills that you're referring to, and it talks about how to communicate and to deliver the business end of the scientific aspects of the industry. So I think those are kind of the talking points or the main points about it. It goes into some of the program will take some of the students through the techniques that are really taught by the management gurus that are out there, like Michael Porter or Deming, who is kind of a quality guru, but still was really involved in leadership stuff. So it kind of takes you through the theories and helps to put them in practical aspects for a scientist or somebody who's technology oriented and can help them develop those leadership type of skills that are kind of demanded on the business end of the company.
That's a good point. For example, decision making, one of the courses is risk management, and I know that one of the assignments has to do with identifying risks and areas of risks within the industry, but also in a specific company, and then making a heat map, learning all about how to do a heat map and doing comparative analyses of of the risks in order to make decisions. And it was interesting because last year with Hurricane Harvey, a lot of the students were in Houston. And so it was like, wow, it was like a perfect example of how, of just like a living example. And it suddenly became really, really relevant.
Yes, exactly. We had an interesting case with one of the prior hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, where the hurricane came through and wiped out New Orleans, and in one of the companies in Houston was Chevron Texaco actually, and they had their Pascagoula plant was wiped out in that hurricane. And while the city of New Orleans took well over a year and even beyond that in trying to recover from the hurricane, the management strategies, the supply chain strategies that were used by Chevron Texaco in the Pascagoula plant actually were able, that plant was completely wiped out and shut down. But within 1 week, they had brought that plant back online and were operational again. And,
that's amazing. 1 week?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's really fast.
The hurricane hit on, I think it was a Friday or Saturday. They actually opened for business again on the following Friday. Now, if you think about that, now think about this for a second. What happened on that is all the rail lines were wiped out. All the roads were completely flooded. Airports were completely shut down. So you have to ask yourself, how in the world did that Pascagoula plant get up and operational? And when they depended on those supply lines. So I ask you, how did they do it?
I don't know. How did they? Obviously, it wouldn't be just in time type of thing.
Yeah,
well, what
they must have
did
prepared.
is they realized that they had their own private dock that had access to the Gulf of Mexico. So after the hurricane passed through, they brought in all the supplies, all the mechanical supplies, the pumps, the engines, the things that they needed to get the plant back operational. Plus, they brought in housing supplies, temporary housing supplies, and they brought in food supplies, all by ocean-going vehicle. By ships or smaller ships and smaller boats that can navigate the waters. And what they did is the compound, the Pascagoula plant, is all encased in a barbed wire fencing. So they brought, everybody had lost their homes. So they knew, the Chevron management knew that they couldn't get people to work if they were worried about their personal situation. So they set up private homes inside the compound using these temporary housing things, and they brought in food and clothing and all this kind of stuff so that all their workers and all their families were completely taken care of and safe inside the compound away from the looters. And
wow.
The workers could then focus on bringing their plant back up to operation. So,
that's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, and what's so fascinating is they thought of everything. So it became definitely a compound. It reminds me of some of the working compounds that they have maybe in like Nigeria, where it's just absolutely self-contained, or Algeria had other ones like Sonatrach. Exactly. Or so yes, interesting.
Exactly. What's amazing about that story too is that the workers realized that they were among the land of the plenty at that point, and the rest of the community had no supplies. So they set up help stations or aid stations outside the compound, and they were able to set up, and they actually had people just coming by, and they were giving out food supplies, clothing supplies to help the rest of the community get back on their feet. So even though Pascagoula was shut off from the rest of the world during the flooding that ensued after the hurricane, they were able to recover and get operational. It's a wonderful story of humanity also, as well as.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. And it wouldn't have worked. One side needed to have the other.
No, exactly. And what's amazing is the workers and the plant management were able to do this without the Chevron Texaco management staff back in Houston and back in California, where the company headquarters was. They did this without even, without the upper level executives even realizing what was going on. They didn't realize all this was going on in the plant because the communications were broken down, but they actually did this
Wow.
On their own, to the amazement of their management staff. The management couldn't get to them. They couldn't help them. There was no way for management people to get into the plant to help them. So the plant was on their own. And they just used good educational, theoretical technique, and they were able to do all these things for the community as well as the plant.
Well, they would be outstanding doomsday preppers too.
Yes, absolutely. So more and more.
So
you know,
why do you think that things like the way that Amazon, for example, and the way they've set up warehouses and the way that they interact with, for example, grocery stores, things like that, how are those changing supply chains?
So there's a lot of different ways that they're changing, and really so much of it anymore hinges on good information. So there's a technique out there, and it's called cross-docking, which is a little bit of a misnomer for supply chain, as an example. But the industry techniques that are used in the oil and gas industry, the energy industry, are also being used in a retailing operation. So, and it all has to do with information. I was not too long ago in a Walmart distribution center, and a Walmart distribution center is very big, very large. And if you imagine this big warehouse-looking thing, what would you, as a consumer, expect to see when you walk in the door of a big distribution center? What would you imagine seeing?
Robots.
Or I guess I imagine it this way, and maybe this is what I'm looking for an answer. I imagine just rows and rows of product on big shelves.
Oh, right.
Yeah, a bunch of stuff.
So, and that's what I thought I was going to see. And in the old days, you would see what they call ASRS systems, which are automatic storage and retrieval systems, where you have these big things that would go down an aisle and then lift up and pick out the product,
right,
and then bring it back down and ship it off to the next, whatever store was being demanded of this product, right? But that's not what I saw when I went into these big distribution centers, which are kind of more modern of what people are seeing now in industry and in business. What you saw when you walked in, it looked like a spaghetti bowl full of conveyors. What would happen is as a truck would back up from the supplier, a big semi truck, and they'd unload it, and they'd start to break down the pallets, and they would read they'd barcode the reader of the product, and they'd sit it on the conveyor, and everything was automatic after that. It would go shooting up into this spaghetti bowl full of conveyors, and then if you walk through the warehouse clear to the other end where it was, instead of receiving, it was shipping, there were chutes going right into the semis, and the product would drop right in there, and there'd be somebody packing it in there nice and neat to go out to the store. And so the average time that a product was spent in the warehouse was 20 minutes. So it went from receiving to shipping and out to the store in 20 minutes. Now, if you think about that in terms of the old days, a retailing operation, and your question is, how has this all changed recently? And that's a very graphic picture of how things have changed. The advancements of industry. It all has to do with information, right? It has to, the information systems have to take what the customer is giving you and translate it into an order to the supplier. Let's say some store over here takes their information and dump it into a database. It's all barcoded at the cash register. It knows what product's out. So it sends an order to P&G, say, if it's Pampers diapers or something that's out, right? They send the truckload out, and they get it in the warehouse, they break it all out, they get it back out to the truck, to the store. So that takes, just a very short amount of time. And it all depends on information systems. So really the programs that we're starting in our MBA program have to do with energy leadership, and has to be in understanding how all these systems relate, and then supply chains, how they all fit together, and information technology, how the information is being used. So it all is one big strategic picture about how managers and leaders can deal with the new technologies that are out there. Not deal with them.
That makes total sense. Go ahead.
Yes.
Well, I was just thinking, a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago, here at APG, we were working with Gazprom, and they asked me to put together an educational program. It's like 5 or 6 weeks. And it was all in supply chain. It was from Gazprom International. So it was a Russian company, but very few of the people coming in were from Russia. They had from Algeria and Vietnam and Bolivia and Russia, but they were really concerned with how to organize the supply chain for the drilling operations throughout the world. And
Yes.
a big chunk of that time was all about information systems.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. All the management techniques and leadership techniques that we teach are all about, managing your money, managing the financing and the risks that you were talking about earlier, managing the inventory flows and the material flows, and then managing the information. So those three key aspects are very important,
It was so fascinating, and I was wondering, as time goes on, how do you think that for example, different aspects of our culture are going to tie into things? Like a lot of it has to do with managing human beings. Where do you see that playing a role?
So, yeah, so there are actually two different terms there. I think when you were asking about managing culture, but then also managing human beings. So culture's a little bit different, and a lot of times company cultures are a lot different in terms of how you manage them versus managing individuals. So, a lot of I think some of the ideas about particularly, it makes me think of one particular book, and it's an older book now, but it was a few years ago it came out, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers know this book. It's a book called Good to Great, and in that book,
right.
Yeah. So it was one of those books that flew off the managerial shelves for a while, and it's kind of on that manager's bookshelf type of thing. So I generally don't like to go to those types of books to quote things, but that was really a good example of how, the author was talking about how important it is to manage individuals and lead individuals to take a company to achieve greatness. But it also dealt with culture a little bit, because it talked quite a bit about how so many companies had failed when they took an individual great leader and then put them in charge of a company that was not doing so well, expecting the same results. And the author made a pretty strong case about showing that culture's a lot harder to influence. And in fact, some of the best managers that were taking companies from good to great were internal candidates that had come up through the system because they understood their own company's culture a lot better than somebody coming in from the outside. So that's what made me think of that. There's a distinct difference that we try to bring out in our curriculum about how to manage culture, but also how to manage individuals within the culture.
That's an interesting point, and a lot of concern right now is in the identifying unconscious bias and basically helping people be aware of their own thought processes. I see it as more of a cognitive behavioralist approach. And I don't know if some of those techniques you think would be effective and should be built into leadership programs, and how?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a definite role for it. It's interesting because a lot of good professors that are recruited into business programs across the country are come from industrial psych. I'm probably saying that wrong. They come from those who specialize in handling people in an industrial situation, and they get into those cognitive type of recognitions and understandings of the individual.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So I think there's, especially in the human resources function, so there's definitely a very strong role for that in the world.
I agree. Yeah, and dealing with change, things like that. I mean, we live in such a dynamic universe, and then also with just the fact that so many companies have a strategy of wanting to be of mergers and acquisitions, so that their goal is to be successful and be acquired by somebody. Well, that's just setting ones up for culture clash.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Have you now talk about a little bit of your experience before you came to Texas A&M and your business experience, because I find it fascinating.
Okay, so my first degree was in chemical engineering, and that came from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. And when I graduated in chemical engineering, the first company that hired me was 3M out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I was assigned to a production facility in a place called Hutchinson, Minnesota. And at that plant at the time, they made Scotch tape, the type that you use to wrap Christmas presents with and things like that. So that's just common Scotch tape, and it's a very popular product for them to this day. And so I started out in that pet plant. We also, at the time, were making Post-it notes now. Post-it
nice.
Notes, yes, they grew to such a volume that they were eventually moved to another plant. But working for 3M gave me a great experience and a great start, I thought. And then from there, I got my master's degree in finance. So part of that came from, your constant debate with the business side of a manufacturing facility, where you're always talking about, and the technical people I think can relate to this, you're talking about trying to put a new piece of equipment in or something, and the accounting function, those folks are asking you questions that it's a whole different set of terminology, right? They're asking about ROAs and ROIs, and ROI is a return on investment, ROA is return on the asset. They want you to measure those things, and as an engineer, you're really not prepared to answer those questions. So I took a leave of absence and went and got a business degree in finance. So now I can talk their language a little bit. And then I finished my master's and eventually ended up with a chemical company. It was called, at the time it was called Celanese. It's just Celanese now. And that company's kind of headquartered out of Dallas, I think.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so that's cool. So I was working for that company, and I decided.
Now, didn't they make cyanide, or is that some other company?
Celanese, I don't remember them ever making that. They have a lot of different divisions. They have a pharmaceutical branch. They have a plastics division. They make common plastics, but plastic pellets that are used in injection molding machines. They had what they call. I was kind of in the engineering resins division that made like things like nylon and other stuff. So
yeah, I was wondering because I worked for Carnegie Chemical before I went back to get my PhD, and I was an international operations analyst. And it's now called Tronox. I was in the titanium dioxide pigment division, and we had a synthetic rutile plant in Mobile, Alabama. And it seems to me that there was a Herx Celanese plant there.
Yeah, and in fact, we bought that product. We used it in some of our applications when I was working.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you were a supplier for us.
Well, I remember 3M was one of our, at 3M, I remember 3M was one of our customers.
Yes, 3M too, but this was when I was at Celanese. So
Oh, nice.
Was also a customer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I went back and got my PhD at that point. Well, in fact, Hearst was a German company. They're no longer in existence, and so they valued education. So my intention when I first went back to get my PhD was to go back to work for Celanese. But at the time it was Herx Celanese, and then they kind of broke apart, and Celanese ended up on its own while I was working on my PhD. So there was really not a company to go back to. So I just at that point decided to stay in academia. So
cool.
Yeah.
Many years of experience, engineering type experience. So
Yeah, no. So
I
think
like
we're getting close to the end of our time here, but we have a very special question that we always ask on Life Edge. And so we want to know, what is one thing that you think has really given you an edge in life? If you can name one.
you know what? I have to say education.
All right.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. We are in a time period right now in the U.S. where the people are choosing professional careers that don't necessarily involve education. But I think if there's one learning that comes out of education is you should always embrace a philosophy of lifelong learning, no matter if you have a high level of education or not. Lifelong learning is very important, and finding ways to continuously learn throughout your life is just a healthy operating philosophy. So that's my life edge.
Yeah. It's definitely.
Well, I totally agree with that one.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's been a really, I just want to really thank you for coming on. It's been really eye-opening, all the stories and examples you gave us, and I think it's just really going to open a lot of people's eyes, like when you're talking about the warehouses and things like that. Like I had no idea that it was like that, you know. Like you said, I was thinking like heaps of stuff. Not much I couldn't
the advances that are going on out there, it's just wonderful to see.
Yeah.
It really is.
It's really great.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been my pleasure, and
Yeah.
I'm just thrilled that we can have this conversation, and that maybe your listeners and viewers would benefit, I hope.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. It's definitely been a pleasure. It's very informative and great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, your students are very lucky to have you as a professor, and the college is very, very lucky to have you as their dean. So,
I really appreciate that compliment. Thank you very much.
It's definitely true.
all right. So, thank you, Dr. Stading, again. And thank you, Dr. Susan Nash. And well, I guess we'll see you next week.
Thank you.